Well, thank you all very much. It's very nice once again to talk to people about the cathedral. I haven't actually given this sort of talk for about 3 years now, for obvious COVID reasons, so I'm a bit rusty. My qualification for talking to you is simply that I've always been here, all my life. We've been thinking recently about the sad death of Her Majesty the Queen. And the only time I ever saw the Queen was in 1963, when she came to the cathedral to mark the opening of the extension. And I was a little boy standing on the corner of York Place with my flag, and I was 8 years old, and I had a wonderful view of the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh as they passed very slowly by. And that was the only time in my life, actually, that I got close to the Queen, no doubt to the Queen's relief. The story of this building is not really a story of a building at all. It's a story of the human beings that lived here, that worked here, that worshipped here. The building is part of the history of this town and this area. And it's a Christian story. It's a story of birth, a story of destruction, a story of resurrection. And it goes back a very long time. The founder of the church here can actually be seen in this window. And you can see in the middle there, not somebody called Woolos, but somebody called Gwynthlew. And I can tell you now that Gwynthlew was nothing like that picture. Nothing at all. Well, why do we call him Woolos when his name is Gwynthlew? The Latin word for Gwynthlew is Gundulus. Gundulus and Woolos are not so different in sound. And over the centuries, that change in speaking the name seems to have taken place. So we call him Woolos, king and confessor. Better to call him thug and pirate, because I think that's what he was. He is, incidentally, the patron saint of pirates. So if you happen to have any pirates in your family and you feel that they need a saint to pray to, Woolos is your man. Why do I say thug? The church is dated to 495 AD. Woolos died, we believe, in 500 AD, on the 29th of March. This may seem to be rather spuriously accurate to you. 29th of March is his festival day. We're in that period which those of us who were taught history properly when we were in school called the Dark Ages. Nowadays, scholars would call them later antiquity or early Middle Ages. But it's that period of time for which we have very few written records. We have two lives that bear on what happened here. One is the life of Gwynthlew himself, and the other of his son, Caddoc. Caddoc was a more famous figure than Gwynthlew. Both of them tell us something about their history of these two people. But they were both written in the 12th century, and they were written at Usk and at Gloucester. And there is significance in that, which I will come to a little bit later. In that period, after the Romans leave Britain, civil order breaks down. And so you've got a kind of gangsterism, really. It's the most powerful figure. It's the person who can bully others, who emerges as the local chief, the local king. Gwynthlew seems to have been this sort of figure. His camp was probably where St. Woolos Hospital now is. Very useful if you're a pirate. You can keep an eye on the ships that are going back and forth. He was a member of a large family of 10, and he himself had 9 children. Nightlife in Newport must have been rather dull in the 5th century. The stories that are recorded of him are not the stories that you would expect of a saint. His wife, Gladys, she was the daughter of the King of Brecon. The King of Brecon wasn't very keen on her marrying Woolos, and so he took a squad of 300 slaves to take Gladys by force. A battle ensued, and he had to be rescued by King Arthur, who conveniently was visiting Caerleon at the time. Not exactly what you expect from a saint. According to the life of Cadoc, Gwynthrew and his wife had to be converted to Christianity by their son. Their son, Cadoc, sent followers of his to convert his parents because he was concerned about their carnal desires. Again, not something that we normally associate with a saint. But one way or another, this man was converted to Christianity. Now, you might be thinking, well, these are rather tall stories. How do we know they're true? Well, we don't. But we do know that Gwynthrew existed. Why? Because there has been a church here dedicated to Gwynthrew for 1,500 years. In Celtic Christianity, this Celtic Christianity we're talking about, in Celtic Christianity it is the custom to name the church after its founder. So whatever the details of Gwynthew's life actually were, we can be pretty sure that he actually existed. And he must have been an impressive figure. When he died, he was buried in the floor of his church. And the church quickly became, as it was for hundreds of years, the burial church of this area. And people wanted to be buried here. They wanted to be near the saint. The church is a pilgrimage church. Pilgrimage is sometimes difficult for us to understand. But I was thinking about this when I was watching the Queen's lying in state. All those people who went to pass by the Queen's coffin, they were drawn by something. Drawn by an extraordinary individual, drawn by the feelings that they had. That's pilgrimage. And this was a pilgrimage church. So there was something about this man that drew people to him. Now, according to one of the stories, when Gwynthrew was converted, he had a vision of angels. And he was told in this vision to look for a white ox with a black spot on its forehead, and to follow that ox, and wherever the ox stopped, there build his church. And so, that we assume is what he did. And that original church, and there have been several churches on this site, that original church was probably where the St. Mary's Chapel that you walk through to come in, it's probably there. That's probably the original area of the church. There are lots of stories about Gwynthrew, quite interesting stories. One is that he saved the area from pillage from one of the Welsh rulers in the early Middle Ages, King Griffin, who sent a force of 40 ships to this area, looted the church, looted the local village. And then, as he made his way back down to the coast, he looked up, and in the storm clouds he saw the saint pursuing him with angels. The effect? Only 2 of those ships survived. There's a message here. Don't mess with this saint. Otherwise, you're going to be in real trouble. If I asked you, why did Harold Godwinson lose the Battle of Hastings? I might get all kinds of answers. I might be told Harold's troops were exhausted from having to march back from the north of England. William was able to land without opposition and set up his base, and so on and so forth. None of it is true. The real truth is that Harold had offended this saint, because one of the stories concerns Harold Godwinson. There was a dispute down in the harbour between Saxon traders and Welsh traders. And the Welsh traders cut the anchor of the Saxon traders and brought it up here and put it in the church. The Saxons were a bit miffed about this, and they went to see Harold Godwinson at a hunting lodge up at Port Stewart. Harold brought a lot of troops down to punish the locals for doing this. He broke into the church and he found some large cheeses being stored there. And so he stole them. But when he cut them open, they were full of blood. He rushed back to the church to make reparation. It was no good. He was going to be punished. That's why he lost the Battle of Hastings. So the story is quite clear. You mess with this saint, you're in a lot of trouble. Now, there's a reason why I tell you that. The church itself was built and rebuilt several times. It was destroyed at least, or damaged severely, at least 3 times. In 875, the Danes destroyed a lot of it. In the incident with King Griffin, there had been damage to the church. And the church was completely destroyed during troubles in the reign of William Rufus. So the church building has changed. And at some point, what was a wattle and door building was turned into a stone building. We know that because in the St. Mary's Chapel, you can't see it, but we know that some of the stonework there is Saxon stonework. So at some point, it was turned into a stone building. And in 1093, William Rufus, rather unusually for him, gave the revenues and the rights of this church, and they were desirable rights because there was a lot of territory attached to it, to the monks at Gloucester. And from that point until the 1880s, the vicars of this church were appointed by the monks at Gloucester, except during the 12th century. Because during the 12th century, Robert of Gloucester, now Robert of Gloucester is a very important figure. He was a relative of the royal family. Now we're talking about a period of unrest and civil war in England. We're talking about what's sometimes called the anarchy. The contest between Matilda, the daughter of Henry I, and Stephen. And for a while, Stephen is king, and he's constantly threatened by the forces of Matilda. You can read all this in Ellis Peters. That's the background to those Ellis Peters detective stories. Robert of Gloucester was a very significant figure. He was Lord of Newport. He had a castle, which is called the Novo Burgo, up the road from here where Stowe Park is, somewhere in that area. It's the original Mott and Bailey Castle. And he appointed his chaplain, a Frenchman called Picot, to be vicar of this church. Needless to say, the monks were not very pleased. They used the revenues from this church to pay their wine bill, and they wanted them back. The dispute took years and years to resolve. It went as far as Rome itself, and the Pope appointed a synod to decide who would have the rights to this church. The monks won. Remember, I told you that the 2 sources for Gwynthru's life come from the 12th century. They come from exactly this dispute. Don't mess with the saint. That was the message of them. That was the message that the monks at Gloucester and at Usk wanted to put forward. It's all part of their propaganda. But whether it was Robert of Gloucester or whether it was the monks, it's in the 12th century that the main part of this building was constructed. This is Romanesque architecture. And almost certainly it's the monks at Gloucester who are responsible for it. Why do I say that? Because there are side aisles. In buildings with a monastic origin in this period, they usually have side aisles. If they're simply parish churches, they don't. But we have side aisles. They were a bit different when they were built. If you look up, you will see windows. So the original roof of the side aisles was much lower than it is today. And it sloped just below the windows. Romanesque architecture. On your way in, and when you get a chance to walk around the building, do have a look at it, you will see the Norman arch. Norman arch is one of the most impressive features of the building. And South Gloucester, South Herefordshire Romanesque, and it's part of that, is very famous. There are some very famous examples of it. And you can see that chevron pattern in the arch, which is very typical. And if you look very carefully at the arch, there are two pillars, one on each side. The pillars themselves are almost certainly Roman. They're chamfered in the Roman manner. And they were almost certainly rescued and incorporated in it. But look above them. Look at the capitals. There are carvings on the capitals. What are those carvings about? We're not sure. Some people look at them and see the story of Adam and Eve. Some people see the story of Noah. Some people see incidents from the life of Woolos. Actually, they could all be true. Because Romanesque layered the meaning of the things that they built. Things didn't just have one meaning. They had several meanings. So they all might be correct. If you look at the pillars here, they're all slightly different. That's a Romanesque characteristic. They liked individuality. So it's that style which you can see in the main part of the building. And from the 12th century, the arch is dated to about 1180. From that time, this has been the core of the building. But of course, there's much more to it than that. Why are the side aisles different? In 1403, the forces of Owen Glendower burnt down Newport. Rather drastic thing to do, but nonetheless, they burnt it down. And they also set fire to this building, destroying the roof and damaging the sides. The Lord of Newport at that time was Humphrey Stafford, who was Duke of Buckingham. Very powerful man. And he set about rebuilding the town and restoring the church. And what he does is he raises the side aisles and puts in perpendicular windows. Now, the windows as we have them now have been restored more than once since then. But they are still of perpendicular design, particularly on this side. And he put the roof on the building. We spent a very long time with enormous effort restoring the roof in recent years. It cost us well over £1 million. But it contains timbers that are some of the oldest timbers in a roof in Britain. The oldest roof of this kind is in Westminster Hall, which you will have seen on television recently. But some of the timbers in the roof are actually older than the ones in Westminster Hall. That doesn't mean to say that it was built before it, but they were used in the construction. In here, in the nave, in the ship, that's what the word nave comes from, of the church. He also probably built the tower. Now, on your way into the building, you might have glanced up and you would have seen a decayed figure on the front of the tower. He's lost his arms, he's lost his leg, the leg loss is fairly recent. In the 19th century, he had both legs. He lost his head probably in the 17th century. And we used to always say, that's Jasper Tudor. Jasper Tudor was the uncle of Henry VII. And it might well be, but it probably isn't the case that Jasper Tudor built the whole tower. He may have built the top section, and there are Tudor emblems on the top section, so it would fit in with Jasper Tudor. What you can see, and you can't see it very well now, but we've got 19th century drawings of it, what you can see of the costume is Tudor costume. So that may well be Jasper Tudor. Jasper Tudor was Lord of Newport at the end of the 15th century, but he wasn't that fond of Newport. He didn't come to it very often, and in his will, he left the sum of £1 to Newport, but not to this church. He left it to the Church of St. Nicholas, which used to be in the centre of town. If you know Newport, you know Austin Friars. That's where the Church of St. Nicholas used to be. So, in the 15th century, there is considerable building restoration here, which brings us, you'll be relieved to hear, up to the end of the Middle Ages. And then we go into that disturbed period of the Reformation. Now, the Reformation didn't touch Wales deeply to begin with, but there are a couple of things which happened here initially. In the side aisles were two chantry chapels, chapels endowed by wealthy local families to say prayers, to say mass for the dead. Edward VI got rid of chantries and took their wealth. And that did happen here in the 16th century. The chantry chapels were completely destroyed. And one of the priests employed in them became the parish priest. But by and large, in the 16th century, things seem to have been left pretty much alone here. Not so in the 17th century. In the 17th century, we decided to kill each other over religion. And we did so in quite spectacular ways. The 17th century is a very troubled century, and no more so than around here. Every religious group flourished in this part of the world, except the established church. There were Roman Catholics. The Marquis of Worcester, who lived in Raglan Castle, was a Roman Catholic, and around him he gathered the Roman Catholics in the area. Abergavenny was a great centre of Roman Catholicism. And in reaction to that, Puritanism, extreme Protestantism. The first chapel, the first Welsh nonconformist chapel, was set up at Llanfacus. And here in St. Woolos, there were problems. In the 1630s, a man called William Avery was vicar of this church, and he was dispossessed of his living because he refused to read the Book of Sports. Now, you might wonder what the Book of Sports is. But in this period, people were expected to spend some of their time training for war. And the Book of Sports told people that on Sunday afternoons you should go out and do some archery or something of that kind. The Puritans objected, not because they objected to killing foreigners. Goodness me, we could hardly object to that. But because they objected to enjoying yourself on a Sunday. Avery refused to read the Book of Sports. He lost his living. And when the Civil War comes, then things here change a great deal. There is no vicar of St. Woolos during the Civil War. The money was given to a Puritan preacher. And there was a lot of destruction inside the church. When you come into the church, you will notice in some of the alcoves the remains of tombs. One very fine tomb would have been that of Sir John Morgan, who built the original Tredegar house. It was an alabaster tomb, only a few sections of it remain. Why? because it was destroyed in the 17th century. It would have been down here. It would have been in the body of the church. And there are older tombs than that, going back to the 13th century, which again we only have fragments of. In the corner there is the Herbert tomb, Sir Walter Herbert. That dates from 1558. It's a resurrection tomb. There's no body inside it. It's a memorial, and it's moved its position more than once in its history. It used to be somewhere up here. That too, although more of it remains, was badly damaged. The font, which you will see on your way in, was turfed out of the building and dumped in the churchyard, only to be rescued in the 19th century. So a great deal of damage was done here during the 17th century. By the end of the 17th century, British people had got rather tired of killing each other, and they'd stopped doing it. They concentrated on much more innocent activities like making money instead. And if you came to this church in the 18th century, it would be very different from your experience of it today. You wouldn't have come through that door, you would have come through those doors. Where we now have the shop was at one time the main entrance into the building and had above it a medieval priest's room. And this part of the building would have been more like a nonconformist chapel than an Anglican church. That section was a charnel house for human remains. What would have been behind me would have been the chancel used for storage. So the actual church was really just a square. It would have been dominated probably by a 3-decker pulpit and box pews. If you go to Nash Church outside Newport, you can still see box pews. Part of my family come from Nash, and I remember very well as a little boy going to baptisms there and being able to hide behind the box pews and play with the hassocks. Nobody could see. So that's what you would have seen here in the 18th century and the early 19th century. But in the 19th century, things change. And one of the reasons they change is wealth, is money. Newport grew exponentially in the 19th century. In 1800, there were about 1,000 people in Newport. In the 1830s, about 10,000 people. By 1870, there were 70,000 people in Newport. A huge increase, built around the docks, built about the wealth that the docks brought in and out of this town, now city. And the houses round here were wealthy people's houses. They were worth £20 a year. Now, to get the vote in 1832, you had to have a house worth £10 a year, and that only increased the electorate by a very small number. So there were wealthy people around here, and that wealth is reflected in the church. And people's ideas of churches in the 19th century changed quite dramatically. In the 18th century, people thought the most important thing that happens in church is the sermon. And so you go to church to listen. And a lot of thought was given into the way churches were designed to make the acoustics better. Even Roman Catholic churches were designed really for listening in. But in the 19th century, this changes. Partly because of the Oxford movement, partly because of the ecclesiologist movement, which was based in Cambridge, people began to change their mind. They began to see that to teach the Christian faith, you didn't just need words, you need pictures. You need to use the whole building to teach the faith. And so people start to change these buildings. And remember, this is a period where medieval equals good. In the 19th century, people were very interested in the Middle Ages. They had a rather fanciful idea of it, but they nonetheless were very interested in. And so you get churches being restored, rebuilt in a very Victorian medieval style. And that's what begins to happen here. In the very early 19th century, 1819, the St. Mary's Chapel was cleared out, it was opened up, it was restored. You could come in that way, you could open up the main doors, and you could come into the building that way as we do today. I better mention the 1830s very quickly. The 1830s is the era of the Chartists. 1839, the Chartist uprising. St. Woolos has a sort of walk-on part in that drama. The Chartists came down the hill on that side into the town, and they fled back up the hill after the firing started. Perhaps up to 50 people were injured or killed in that episode, but 10 people were killed actually at the time, and their bodies were brought here at dead of night and buried in the churchyard. And we get people every now and again looking for where the Chartists are buried. The truth is, we've no idea, but very likely where the road now is. They would not have been buried close to the church. They would have been buried on the edge of the churchyard. We don't even know their names. You can work out some of their names, but you can't be sure what their names are. No record in the parish register of this. There's just 10 people are buried. That's all that's in the parish register. But since the Vicar of St. Woolos was also a member of the Society for the Protection of Property, it isn't perhaps surprising that we don't hear that much about the actual Chartists. In the late 1840s, 1846, a man called Hawkins was appointed as vicar of this church. He remained vicar of this church until 1896. He was in his 90s. And there is a story, which I will repeat to you now, about a vicar in this diocese who was still in office in his 90s. And the bishop wrote to him to suggest that he might consider retirement. And he replied to the bishop, "My lord, had I realized this was a temporary appointment, I would never have taken it up." Well, Hawkins was a remarkable man. He was very influenced by this idea of restoring the building. And in 1853, there is a thoroughgoing restoration of the building. Behind me would have been the original chancel. That Hawkins rebuilt, and he built a vestry at the side. He rebuilt, at least in part, the entrance there. He redid the floors, put concrete on the floors. He restored the windows. He opened up the window that is above the entrance to let more light into the building. Earlier, there had been lancet windows put in the St. Mary's Chapel, which you can see. And actually, if you look in the St. Mary's Chapel, you'll see a cupboard which actually covers up the original doorway when it was just a small stone church. He moved the singing gallery, the rood which would have gone across there, and you can see we have a sort of rood today. The rood which would have gone across there was taken down in the 17th century, but there was a singing gallery at the top. You can see the small door that you can go in and out of. Well, I wouldn't go out of it because you'll break your neck, but if there was something to go into. And there used to be a singing gallery there, actually. That was taken down, and an organ was installed. But the congregation were not terribly happy about this, and to placate them, instead of putting the organ there, it was actually put against the back wall. Now, in the 1870s, the organ was moved into the Crinder Chapel, which is more or less where it is now. But at one time, it was actually on the back wall, and we've actually got pictures, we've actually got watercolours of the steps that went up to it. And of course, it's a very good place for an organ because you get the sound right through the church. So there's a great deal done to the church in the middle of the 19th century. The vicarage was built by Hawkins, the vicarage you can see across the road. The original vicarage was in Carer Road. Hawkins, of his own money, I think, built the vicarage that you can see there. And he could do that because he was very well paid. The vicar of St. Woolos remained very well paid down to the 20th century when they equalized stipends. So it attracted some quite vigorous clergy. More was done to the church in the early 20th century. Under Archdeacon Griffiths, there was further restoration of the building. The roof, which had panels on it at one time, was opened up so you can see the 15th century roof. There had been pinnacles put on the tower. There'd never been pinnacles on the tower originally, but a hurricane in the 1870s blew one of the pinnacles down into the St. Mary's Chapel. And when we had the roof restored, the timbers there are only partly original. Many of them are Victorian because of that accident. So the pinnacles were taken down. Again, the vestry was rebuilt. There were further changes to the chancel. And during the 19th century as well, the stained glass, except for the two sets of windows you can see here, they're a bit later, but most of the stained glass was put in. And the stained glass is done by Hardman of Birmingham, a firm that is still going to this day. The finest window is the window that you can see, you can't see it actually very easily, but you can walk around and see it, of the presentation, in what we call the presentation chapel. And that was authorized by Hawkins when he was here. And he wrote to Hardman and said, I want a window which tells the story of the presentation. And Hardman wrote back and said, that's fine, we're just putting one in Cirencester. If you want to go and see it, please do. Hawkins went to Cirencester, and indeed some people here have been to Cirencester with the Friends of the Cathedral, and there is indeed a window there on the presentation. But Hawkins wrote back and said that won't do. He said, I want a much more colourful, much more dramatic window than that. So our window is a lot better than the one in Cirencester. Now, by the time we get to the 20th century, what's happening in the church as a whole affects us greatly. The church in Wales was disestablished. It was broken away from the Church of England, and after the First World War, it became a completely separate church. It was decided that there should be more dioceses than there had been before. There used to be 4. They decided to create 2 new ones, Swansea and Brecon and Monmouth. And in 1922, a new diocese of Monmouth was created. Now, a diocese needs a cathedral. Where was the cathedral going to be? There were lots of ideas. Let's build a new cathedral at Ridgeway. Then it would overlook the whole town. Let's restore Tintern Abbey. Make that the cathedral. There was one snag. No money. And for a long time there were 2 pro-cathedrals, St. Mary's Monmouth and this, St. Woolos. But St. Woolos was set in the biggest town in the county. And so after the Second World War, in 1949, the decision was made to make this the cathedral church of the Diocese of Monmouth. But it soon became apparent that the church wasn't really big enough. In the 1950s, there was the consecration of a bishop here. Now, in the 1950s, people were still interested in religion. Even the BBC was interested in religion. And they wanted to come and film it. But their cameras were too big. There wasn't the room to film it. And so the decision was made to extend the cathedral and to extend it in that direction. And so what you see behind me is relatively new, dating from the 1960s. It was designed by a man called Alban Carrow, And Caro wanted something that was in tune with the medieval building, but was still something of its own day. And the most striking thing about it is the far east end behind the high altar. And there you've got a mural and you've got a window. The mural was designed by John Piper, whose work is becoming more fashionable again. And the window was made by a man called Patrick Rentians. And when the Queen celebrated, I think, her Diamond Jubilee, the House of Commons gave her a stained glass window, which was also designed by a Rentians. So this is a long-lived family that has been involved in stained glass. The Piper is quite controversial even today. And when the idea for this was put forward by Piper, you know the story, of course, of Piper and George VI. The Queen Mother asked Piper to do some watercolours of Windsor Castle during the Second World War. And he produced a series of watercolours, all rather dark and gloomy because it was the wartime. And the king is said when he saw these watercolours, "You didn't have much luck with the weather, Mr. Piper, did you?" Well, Piper had a lot of trouble with the Dean and Chapter. When he showed his design to the Dean and Chapter, they didn't like it. And there was a good deal of correspondence between Piper and the Chapter. In the end, Piper said, "Look, if you go ahead with this, I will reduce my fee." Now, everybody who's been involved in church affairs will know that the moment something like reducing fees is mentioned, people will leap at it, which is why we have the mural that we do have. Now, when I used to give these talks, I used to be able to say exactly what that mural meant. I knew precisely what it meant. If you look at it carefully, there are flecks of red in it. And I thought, yes, this is the mighty wind of the Acts of the Apostles, the flames that rest upon the Apostles. And I used to tell people this. It's bunkum. It's not true at all. Actually, in the correspondence, Piper says there is no message behind it. It is a purely decorative creation. You can read into it whatever you like. But it is nonetheless of a striking feature here, as your eye is led when you come in, right to the east end. The cannon stalls are by Thompson of Kilburn. And the thing about Thompson that people always remember is the little mouse which he carved into his creations. You can find that if you have a look for it. So that's the story of this cathedral, not quite up to the present day, but certainly up to the 1960s. Since then, other things have happened. The pews have been removed, and we've got chairs. We've got a nave altar, which we didn't have before. The space is used in different ways. But there is a story here. And the story is of one of continuing faith. This church has stood here for 1,500 years. It stood here as a monument to the Christian faith. It stood here as a monument to the people who've lived in Newport and still live here today and still come to this church. And there is a moral to my story. There is a thug. And the moral is, even thugs can go to heaven. Thank you very much.